June 1944. Normandy's hedgerows bristled with the tension of relentless fighting. Days after the Allied landings, Canadian formations pushed inland from Juno Beach, engaging retreating German units and probing for weaknesses. Among the forces they faced was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a young but fiercely indoctrinated SS formation known for brutal counterattacks against Allied troops. In small hamlets and crossroads near Cannes, Canadians captured German soldiers. Elsewhere, elements of the 12th SS seized Canadian troops in fierce clashes around Authie and Putot-en-Bessin. Those captured men were meant to be prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Instead, in several remote sites across the Normandy countryside, groups of Canadian soldiers taken prisoner were illegally executed by their captors in cold blood. At the Abbaye d'Ardennes, a group of Canadians, once comrades on the battlefield, were isolated, guarded, then shot one by one. News of these killings spread slowly among Canadian units. The horror of these murders was not just in the loss of life, but in the betrayal of the rules of war itself, a brutal shock that would shape how Canadians viewed both enemy conduct and their own resolve. June 1944. The Normandy coastline was a cauldron of preparation and anticipation. Months of meticulous planning by the Allied forces had culminated in Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. For the Canadians, the objective was Juno Beach, a 5-mile stretch of sand fortified with obstacles, mines, and entrenched German positions. Their mission? To secure the beachhead, advance inland, and link with British and American forces to push the German occupiers back. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by armored regiments and artillery, spearheaded the assault on Juno. The soldiers, largely volunteers and recent conscripts, were trained in combined arms tactics, yet few could fully grasp the scale of the resistance they would face. German defenders, particularly the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, were notorious for their fanaticism and ruthless combat style. Composed largely of young, indoctrinated men, the division had been deployed to Normandy to stem the Allied advance and punish any incursion with extreme force. After the initial beach landings, Canadian troops began moving through the bocage, the patchwork of hedgerows, orchards, and narrow lanes that defined the Normandy countryside. These hedgerows, natural defensive barriers, allowed German units to launch sudden ambushes, conceal machine guns, and mount counterattacks. For the Canadians, each advance required careful coordination between infantry, engineers, and armor, often under heavy enemy fire. Casualties were high, but so was determination. Every hill, every village captured brought them closer to their strategic goal: liberating occupied France and opening the path to Germany. By mid-June, Canadian forces had begun engaging German patrols deeper inland. Alongside the battles for Caen and surrounding villages, small groups of soldiers were occasionally captured by the SS. These captures were not routine. Reports indicate that the 12th SS Panzer Division targeted Canadian units with particular severity, driven by orders to punish resistance and instill fear. The captured soldiers were supposed to be prisoners of war, protected under international law, yet in practice, these rules were often ignored in the chaos of rapid maneuvers and ideological indoctrination. One critical location was Abbaye d'Ardennes, a small abbey northwest of Caen. During the first weeks after D-Day, German forces used the abbey as a temporary command and holding site. Canadian patrols had conducted multiple reconnaissance missions in the area, assessing German positions and attempting to recover any stranded comrades. The abbey, however, became a sight of horror. Elements of the 12th SS, isolated from oversight and emboldened by fanaticism, executed a group of Canadian prisoners captured in nearby skirmishes. Historical records document that 156 Canadians were killed in multiple scattered executions across the Normandy countryside, including the Abbaye, Putot-en-Bessin, and Authie. These massacres shocked Allied commanders and reverberated through Canadian units, influencing operational caution and intensity. The environment in which these atrocities occurred was unforgiving. Soldiers advancing through villages faced ruined buildings, mined streets, and snipers concealed in attics and cellars. Communications were sporadic, supply lines stretched, and every movement exposed men to sudden engagement. Despite this, Canadian units pressed on, balancing offensive objectives with the grim knowledge that captured comrades might not survive if taken by the enemy. It was in this tense, morally complex context that the Normandy massacres unfolded, a convergence of strategic necessity, extreme enemy brutality, and Canadian resolve under fire. By combining meticulous operational planning with disciplined execution, Canadian forces continued to push inland. Yet the massacre served as a chilling reminder. Victory in Normandy was measured not only by territory gained, but by the resilience and ethical courage of the soldiers facing an enemy willing to violate every law of war. The weeks following D-Day were marked by relentless advance and constant danger. Canadian units, now moving beyond the beachheads, faced an environment transformed by war. Villages bore the scars of shelling, roads were cratered from artillery fire, and fields were littered with the remnants of destroyed German armor. Civilians, caught between the opposing forces, often fled or hid, leaving the landscape eerily silent between bursts of gunfire. For Canadian soldiers, each mission required a careful balance of aggression and caution. Amid this uncertainty, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend demonstrated the depth of their ruthlessness. Known for their fanatic discipline and ideological indoctrination, these troops treated captured Canadians with extreme brutality. In multiple accounts, small groups of Canadian prisoners were separated from their units during ambushes and executed in violation of the Geneva Conventions. The Abbaye Dardenne massacre, documented by post-war investigations, remains one of the most notorious examples. Canadian POWs, captured after skirmishes around Caen, were taken to the Abbaye and systematically killed by SS personnel. These actions were part of a broader pattern of SS reprisals against Allied troops, often in retaliation for perceived defiance or local resistance. The Canadian command structure reacted with urgency. Intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and local reconnaissance revealed that these executions were not isolated incidents, but part of a calculated pattern of terror. Field commanders emphasized both caution and vigilance, instructing units to move with speed and discipline to minimize the risk of capture. Soldiers were reminded of the stakes. Any misstep could result in loss of life, not only for themselves, but for comrades and civilians in the area. While German atrocities escalated, Canadian soldiers continued to engage in carefully coordinated operations. Infantry, armored units, and engineers combined to clear villages, secure crossroads, and neutralize pockets of resistance. Historical accounts describe patrols advancing in small groups to reduce exposure, using hedgerows for cover, and employing grenade and small arms tactics to dislodge enemy forces entrenched in the bocage. Canadian discipline and tactical training allowed them to succeed even in the face of unexpected threats, a factor that would prove critical when confronting the SS units responsible for the massacres. The psychological impact on Canadian soldiers was profound. News of murdered comrades traveled through units slowly, carried by survivors, dispatches, and reports from local civilians. The realization that captured soldiers could be executed instilled a mix of horror and determination. Many accounts note that this knowledge strengthened their resolve to fight decisively and with moral clarity, emphasizing the protection of their own troops and the humane treatment of any prisoners they might take. Canadian commanders consistently reminded soldiers that they must maintain discipline and respect for the rules of war, even when the enemy did not. Geography played a critical role in these operations. The Normandy countryside, with its dense hedgerows and narrow lanes, allowed small SS units to launch surprise attacks, often isolating Canadian patrols. At the same time, these natural barriers offered Canadian troops defensive advantages, enabling disciplined squads to control villages, establish observation points, and coordinate firepower effectively. Combined with careful reconnaissance and intelligence, these tactics allowed the Canadians to counter SS brutality and maintain momentum in their advance. Civil interactions added another layer of complexity. Many local French citizens had witnessed the massacres or fled before combat reached their villages. Canadian soldiers often assisted civilians, providing medical care, securing property, and ensuring safe passage through contested areas. These actions highlighted the dual mission of the Canadian Army in Normandy: advance strategically while upholding humanitarian principles. By mid-June, as Canadian forces continued their push toward Caen and the surrounding areas, the Normandy massacres stood as a stark testament to the brutality of the conflict. The events at Abbaye d'Ardennes and other locations illustrated both the ruthlessness of the 12th SS and the moral courage of Canadian troops who faced a foe willing to flout every law of war. The human experience of the Normandy massacres is perhaps the most visceral and enduring aspect of this dark chapter. Canadian soldiers, fresh from the beaches of Juno and the initial inland push, were suddenly confronted with the consequences of an enemy willing to violate every rule of warfare. For those who stumbled upon the aftermath, bodies of comrades executed in isolated hamlets or held in makeshift detention points, the horror was immediate and personal. Letters and reports from the period described the shock, the quiet disbelief, and the solemn determination that followed. Soldiers faced a dual reality: the pressing necessity to continue advancing under fire, and the moral imperative to honor the lives of fallen comrades by acting decisively against a ruthless enemy. Yet, the human story was not only one of grief. Courage manifested in countless small actions. Patrols advanced under fire, recovering wounded soldiers, providing aid to civilians, and neutralizing pockets of SS resistance. One patrol at Abbaye d'Ardennes, according to post-war testimonies, encountered the site of the massacre shortly after the events. The men, though shaken, organized themselves quickly, securing the area, tending to survivors, and preparing to report the atrocity to higher command. Their actions demonstrated not only bravery, but a deep ethical commitment. Even when confronted with atrocity, they maintained discipline, restraint, and humanity. The tactical angle underscores the complexity of operations in Normandy. The bocage, with its dense hedgerows and narrow lanes, offered both cover and concealment for the Germans, enabling small units to isolate and ambush Canadian patrols. For the Canadians, small unit tactics were essential. Squads moved in coordinated bounds, using hedgerows as cover, clearing buildings systematically, and employing suppressive fire when necessary. Grenades were critical in clearing bunkers, cellars, and fortified positions where SS troops might be concealed. Canadian engineers often followed closely, ensuring that obstacles and mines were removed to maintain momentum and reduce risk to infantry units. Armored support also played a significant role. Sherman tanks and self-propelled artillery provided mobile firepower capable of neutralizing fortified enemy positions. Coordinating between infantry and armor required disciplined communication, often through radio operators who maintained contact under intense pressure. These technical and tactical considerations were not abstract. They determined whether a patrol would survive, whether a village could be secured, or whether captured comrades could be rescued or avenged. Technology extended beyond firepower. Field telephones, radios, and message runners allowed Canadian units to share intelligence rapidly, request reinforcements, and coordinate artillery support. Reconnaissance teams, often on bicycles or light vehicles, scouted ahead to identify enemy positions. These capabilities were critical in the chaotic environment of Normandy, where rapid decisions under stress could save lives. The human and tactical elements were intertwined. Soldiers relied on each other, on disciplined movements, and on careful use of terrain and technology. Decisions were made in split seconds, yet each reflected training, experience, and moral resolve. When confronting SS units known for their brutality, Canadian troops maintained composure, acting decisively but ethically. These choices, small, precise, and disciplined, exemplify battlefield heroics grounded not in fantasy, but in real, documented operational conduct. Through the lens of human courage, tactical innovation, and technological application, the Normandy massacres are understood not only as a story of atrocity, but as a testament to Canadian resilience and moral courage. Soldiers faced horror, yet they advanced with purpose, safeguarding civilians and respecting the principles of warfare even when the enemy had abandoned them. Leadership in the chaos of Normandy demanded both clarity and courage. Canadian officers, from platoon leaders to battalion commanders, faced an extraordinary test, coordinating movements in an environment of fragmented intelligence, hedgerow concealment, and an enemy that disregarded the laws of war. Officers of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division were trained to anticipate enemy maneuvers, adapt tactics on the fly, and maintain morale among troops confronting extreme violence. Reports from the period note that leaders often had to make split-second decisions under fire, balancing operational objectives with the ethical responsibility to protect their soldiers and any civilians in the vicinity. One critical aspect of leadership during this period was response to atrocity. Knowledge of the massacres of Canadian POWs, particularly at Abbaye, reached frontline units through reconnaissance and local intelligence. Commanders faced a moral and tactical dilemma: how to pursue objectives while neutralizing enemy forces responsible for war crimes without compromising discipline. Historical accounts emphasize that Canadian leadership stressed restraint and adherence to the rules of war, even when confronting SS units notorious for brutality. This discipline distinguished Canadian forces, setting a standard for ethical conduct in the midst of horror. Understanding the enemy was equally vital. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend represented both a tactical and psychological challenge. Composed largely of young, ideologically indoctrinated soldiers, the unit exhibited high aggression, ruthless efficiency, and willingness to execute prisoners. Intelligence reports indicated that the SS units had a tendency to isolate small Allied detachments and apply disproportionate force, reflecting a combination of military doctrine and ideological zeal. Recognizing these tendencies allowed Canadian commanders to anticipate ambushes, deploy supporting fire, and clear villages systematically. They trained their soldiers to anticipate ambushes, use grenades and small arms efficiently, and maintain communication with supporting units. These tactical decisions were informed not only by military necessity, but by an understanding of the ethical landscape. Every maneuver was designed to minimize unnecessary suffering while achieving strategic objectives. In the context of the Normandy massacres, these angles converge in moments of profound tension. Small Canadian units advancing through hedgerows or entering isolated villages had to make rapid decisions under the constant threat of enemy fire and the lingering knowledge of executed comrades. Each choice, whether to engage, flank, or retreat, reflected the combined influence of leadership, enemy psychology, and moral judgment. Post-war analyses highlight that the discipline and ethical standards maintained by Canadian forces under these conditions were exceptional, demonstrating a commitment to humane warfare even when confronted with inhumanity. Through the leadership displayed, the calculated understanding of the enemy, and the moral framework guiding actions, the Normandy massacres reveal not only the brutality of conflict, but also the integrity and heroism of Canadian soldiers. Their actions were neither reckless nor vindictive. They were measured, courageous, and morally grounded, a testament to a professional army operating under the most extreme conditions. By late June 1944, Canadian forces had begun consolidating positions inland from Juno Beach. The push toward Caen and its surrounding villages was relentless, driven by both strategic necessity and the imperative to respond to the brutal actions of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Reports of massacred comrades, particularly at Abbaye and other nearby hamlets, had spread through the ranks. Commanders knew that every advance would carry both tactical and moral weight. The need to secure territory, protect civilians, and confront an enemy capable of cold-blooded executions. Small Canadian patrols moved through narrow lanes and hedgerows with careful coordination. Each squad was trained for rapid assault, communication, and cover. Grenades became essential tools, used to clear fortified cellars and buildings where SS fighters had entrenched themselves. Historical accounts describe Canadian soldiers advancing under intermittent fire, carefully suppressing enemy positions and clearing each structure systematically. The objective was clear: neutralize hostile forces while minimizing additional loss of life. The village of Authie became a focal point for such confrontations. Here, Canadian reconnaissance had identified SS positions used for both combat operations and the detention of prisoners. As the patrol advanced, they encountered sniper fire from concealed positions. Soldiers relied on tactical coordination, one squad providing suppressive fire while another flanked the enemy, clearing houses room by room. Grenades were thrown into cellars and attics where resistance persisted, dislodging small groups of SS fighters without unnecessary exposure. Each movement was measured, reflecting both training and ethical restraint. At Putot-en-Bessin, a similar scenario unfolded. Canadian units engaged German forces responsible for prior massacres, using a combination of small arms, machine guns, and light mortars to neutralize threats. Casualty reports indicate intense skirmishes, but also highlight the effectiveness of disciplined Canadian tactics. Unlike their adversaries, Canadian soldiers did not execute prisoners in retaliation. Captured SS personnel were detained according to standard procedures, reflecting a conscious adherence to the rules of war. The psychological intensity of these operations was immense. Soldiers moved through villages, knowing what might have happened to their comrades in similar locations. The shock of discovering the executed Canadians at Abbaye lingered in every decision. Yet, instead of provoking reckless reprisals, Canadian units demonstrated moral clarity. Leaders emphasized maintaining discipline, using firepower judiciously, and protecting civilians. In this crucible, battlefield heroics and ethical conduct were inseparable. Communication and coordination were critical. Field radios allowed platoon commanders to call in artillery support when entrenched SS positions proved resilient. Reconnaissance teams relayed enemy movements in real time, enabling rapid tactical adjustments. Sherman tanks, often accompanying infantry, provided both cover and firepower, allowing soldiers to maneuver through streets and fields with reduced risk. These combined arms operations exemplified Canadian battlefield effectiveness, ensuring that engagements were both strategically and morally executed. By the end of these operations, the Canadian units had neutralized multiple SS detachments responsible for the massacres. Survivors reported heavy enemy casualties, the destruction of fortified positions, and the recovery of some equipment and intelligence. The confrontations were decisive. They removed immediate threats, reclaimed contested villages, and sent a clear signal to remaining SS units that Canadian forces would respond swiftly and effectively to brutality. Through these engagements, the Normandy massacres became a turning point not only tactically, but morally. Canadian soldiers proved that courage, training, and adherence to ethical conduct could prevail even against an enemy unbound by law. Every calculated movement, every suppressed fire, and every house cleared reflected a commitment to battlefield heroics infused with humanity. In the first week of July 1944, the focus of Canadian operations shifted toward consolidating control over villages northwest of Caen. Among these, Putot-en-Bessin and surrounding hamlets had become flashpoints, where small groups of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend remained entrenched. The SS, emboldened by previous successes and ideological indoctrination, resisted with both tenacity and brutality. For Canadian soldiers, each encounter carried the dual burden of tactical necessity and the emotional weight of recent massacres. A typical engagement began with reconnaissance teams moving along the bocage lanes, identifying enemy positions concealed behind hedgerows, ruins, and farmhouses. Infantry squads advanced cautiously, coordinating suppressive fire while armored units flanked hostile positions. Grenades were deployed with precision, targeting basements or attics where snipers and small detachments might hold out. These small unit tactics, refined through weeks of combat, allowed Canadians to systematically neutralize threats while minimizing their own casualties. At Putot-en-Bessin, a Canadian platoon encountered a reinforced SS position. Machine guns fired from behind rubble, forcing soldiers to seek cover. A squad leader, utilizing information from scouts, orchestrated a coordinated assault. One team advanced to the flank, two others provided covering fire, and engineers prepared to breach fortified doors. Within minutes, Canadian forces had cleared the house, capturing several SS soldiers and eliminating active resistance in the immediate area. This measured, disciplined response contrasted sharply with the enemy's cruelty, showcasing the professionalism and moral clarity of the Canadians. These operations were not without cost. Reports document Canadian casualties during the village assaults, including wounded soldiers caught in crossfire or exposed to sniper fire. Yet the combined arms approach, infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery, proved decisive. Soldiers often moved in close coordination with Sherman tanks, which provided both suppressive fire and mobile cover. Communication via field radios enabled real-time adjustments to rapidly changing battlefield conditions, ensuring that each maneuver minimized risk while maximizing tactical effectiveness. Beyond the immediate tactical success, the engagements carried profound psychological and moral significance. Each village secured and each SS unit neutralized was a step toward justice for the murdered POWs at Abbaye d'Ardennes. Canadian soldiers approached these operations with a sense of purpose that blended courage with restraint. Post-war testimonies highlight that troops were acutely aware of the contrast between their own conduct and the atrocities committed by the enemy. Every life preserved, every civilian protected, reinforced the ethical standards that defined the Canadian approach in Normandy. By mid-July, Canadian forces had systematically cleared the remaining pockets of SS resistance in the northern sectors. The 3rd Infantry Division reported the elimination of multiple enemy squads responsible for prior massacres, as well as the recovery of intelligence, weapons, and documentation detailing German operations. Casualty assessments indicate that the 12th SS suffered severe losses, further diminishing their operational effectiveness. These decisive engagements secured key villages, stabilized supply lines, and allowed Canadian units to support broader Allied operations aimed at capturing Caen and advancing toward Falaise. Equally important was the lasting impression on the soldiers themselves. The Normandy massacres had introduced an unprecedented moral challenge: how to maintain ethical conduct when confronted with an enemy willing to commit unlawful executions. The disciplined professional response, tactical precision combined with humane treatment of prisoners and civilians, became a defining characteristic of the Canadian forces throughout the campaign. Leadership, training, and moral resolve coalesced in the crucible of battle, proving that courage was not merely measured by aggression, but by the ability to act decisively while upholding principles. These climactic operations marked both a tactical and ethical turning point. Canadian forces had successfully neutralized enemy threats, secured key positions, and demonstrated battlefield heroics informed by moral clarity. The repercussions were immediate. Remaining SS units in Normandy operated with increased caution, while Canadian morale and cohesion were strengthened by the tangible outcomes of disciplined action. More broadly, the events underscored a central truth of warfare: that professionalism, courage, and humanity could prevail even amidst the most horrific conditions. With villages cleared, enemy positions neutralized, and operational objectives achieved, Canadian forces transitioned from immediate combat to consolidation. By late July 1944, the immediate battles of northern Normandy had subsided, leaving a grim legacy behind. Canadian forces, having advanced inland from Juno Beach and neutralized SS detachments, began to assess the scale of the atrocities committed against their comrades. At sites such as Abbaye d'Ardennes, Putot-en-Bessin, and Authie, investigators documented the killings of 156 Canadian POWs, confirming systematic violations of the Geneva Convention by the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. The immediate operational impact was profound. Canadian patrols and units incorporated heightened caution in subsequent advances. Checkpoints were established at villages and crossroads, reconnaissance missions were intensified, and intelligence gathering on enemy movements became paramount. Commanders emphasized vigilance, reminding troops that the SS, having already executed prisoners, could not be treated like conventional opponents. Yet, in parallel, a strict adherence to ethical conduct was reinforced. Soldiers were instructed to detain any captured SS combatants according to the rules of war, a policy that distinguished Canadian forces from their ruthless adversaries. Reports compiled by the Canadian Army detail both material and human costs. Beyond the 156 POWs murdered, dozens of soldiers were wounded or killed during operations to secure key villages and eliminate remaining SS resistance. Equipment losses were relatively limited, but the psychological toll on frontline units was significant. Post-war testimonies recount soldiers struggling with the knowledge that comrades had been executed, and yet taking solace in the measured, disciplined actions that followed. The juxtaposition of atrocity and professionalism would shape Canadian military culture in Normandy and beyond. Strategically, the aftermath of the massacres influenced both immediate operations and broader planning. Allied commanders recognized that SS units operating in isolated pockets were prone to extreme violence, necessitating careful coordination of infantry, armor, and artillery to minimize risk. Villages were approached with combined arms tactics, ensuring that infantry and armored units supported each other in clearing buildings, hedgerows, and fortified positions. These operational adjustments, born from necessity, reflected lessons learned under fire and from the brutality inflicted on Canadian POWs. The aftermath also extended to moral and legal dimensions. Reports gathered by Canadian intelligence contributed to post-war trials of SS personnel, including the prosecution of Kurt Meyer, a divisional commander implicated in the unlawful executions. Eyewitness accounts, field reports, and recovered documents provided critical evidence of deliberate war crimes. These prosecutions underscored the importance of documentation and accountability, and reinforced the principle that even in the midst of total war, legal and ethical standards mattered. Civilian populations in the affected villages were another key element of the aftermath. Many inhabitants had fled during the fighting or observed the massacres from hiding. Canadian troops, often tasked with assisting civilians, provided medical aid, secured property, and ensured that survivors were protected. These actions highlighted the dual responsibility of the Canadian Army, achieving tactical objectives while upholding humanitarian principles. This combination of military effectiveness and moral conduct would become a hallmark of Canadian operations throughout the Normandy campaign. By the end of July, the immediate operational theater had stabilized. Canadian forces had secured the northern sectors of Normandy, eliminated SS threats, and recovered from the shock of massacres committed against their comrades. Yet the legacy of these events lingered. Every soldier carried the memory of executed comrades. Every commander reflected on the moral weight of decisions made under fire, and the army as a whole solidified procedures to prevent further atrocities and maintain discipline in combat. The wider consequences of the Normandy massacres reverberated throughout the Canadian Army and Allied command. Field reports emphasized the need to adapt operational planning to account for enemy units prone to extreme brutality. Tactical doctrine evolved. Small Canadian patrols were reinforced. Combined arms coordination was emphasized, and reconnaissance was intensified before entering contested villages. This approach minimized casualties while maintaining offensive momentum. Casualty assessments provide a sobering picture. Beyond the 156 POWs executed, Canadian units suffered hundreds of wounded and killed during the clearing of northern Normandy villages. Equipment losses were relatively contained, but the psychological toll was profound. Soldiers who discovered massacred comrades faced intense emotional strain, yet testimonies consistently highlight their resilience and moral clarity. The atrocities, horrific as they were, strengthened Canadian cohesion and determination to advance with both discipline and ethical rigor. The legal and historical implications were equally significant. Eyewitness accounts, intelligence reports, and recovered documentation formed the backbone of post-war investigations and trials. Kurt Meyer, commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, was ultimately tried and convicted for ordering unlawful executions of POWs. These prosecutions underscored a central wartime truth. Even amidst total war, accountability and justice could prevail. Canadian forces contributed critical evidence, including survivor testimony and battlefield documentation, cementing their role not only as warriors but as custodians of lawful conduct. Strategically, the massacres influenced broader Allied operations. Recognizing that SS units could be unpredictable and lethal, commanders prioritized securing supply routes, fortifying captured villages, and maintaining tight communication networks. Combined arms tactics became standard practice. Infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers coordinated to systematically clear resistance while mitigating the risk of ambush. Canadian forces, having confronted the consequences of unrestrained enemy violence, applied these lessons with precision, demonstrating both operational effectiveness and moral integrity. The human dimension of the aftermath cannot be overstated. Soldiers contended with the emotional weight of executed comrades while continuing offensive operations. Letters home, diaries, and post-war interviews reveal a dual narrative: grief and horror on one hand, courage and ethical steadfastness on the other. Commanders noted that maintaining discipline in these circumstances was a defining feature of Canadian operations. Acts of battlefield heroism were measured not by vengeance, but by the ability to engage decisively while adhering to the laws of war. Civilian interactions further reflected Canadian professionalism. Villages that had witnessed or narrowly escaped SS violence received protection and assistance. Medical aid was provided to the wounded, and property secured to prevent looting or reprisals. These actions reinforced the Canadian commitment to humanitarian principles, contrasting starkly with the ideological fanaticism of the 12th SS. Civilians, though traumatized, often assisted Canadian units with intelligence or logistical support, creating a collaborative dynamic that strengthened both military effectiveness and moral legitimacy. By August 1944, northern Normandy had largely stabilized under Allied control. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division had not only advanced strategically, but had confronted one of the darkest examples of enemy brutality in the campaign. The Normandy massacres left an indelible mark. Operational doctrine was refined, legal precedents established, and the psychological resilience of Canadian troops hardened. Above all, the events highlighted a crucial aspect of Canadian military identity: courage tempered with ethics, and battlefield heroism rooted in humanity. The Normandy massacres remain one of the darkest chapters in Canadian war history, a stark reminder of the cruelty of conflict and the human cost of ideology unchecked by law. The execution of 156 Canadian POWs by the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was not merely a military incident. It was a deliberate act of terror that challenged the very principles of humanity and justice on the battlefield. Yet, amidst this horror, the courage, discipline, and moral clarity of Canadian soldiers shone through. They advanced with purpose, safeguarded civilians, and captured or neutralized enemy combatants without succumbing to vengeance. Their actions underscored a central truth of warfare. Heroism is measured not only by feats of combat, but by adherence to ethics even when confronted with inhumanity. In villages like Abbaye d'Ardennes, Putot-en-Bessin, and Authie, Canadian forces demonstrated battlefield heroics grounded in morality, a commitment that became a defining characteristic of the Canadian Army in Normandy. These events also left a profound imprint on the post-war world. Evidence gathered by Canadian forces contributed directly to the prosecution of war criminals like Kurt Meyer, ensuring that accountability prevailed even after the guns fell silent. The Normandy massacres remind us that history is shaped not only by the brutality of the few, but by the courage and integrity of those who refuse to abandon humanity under fire. Disclaimer: this documentary recounts verified historical events from World War II. Some content may be disturbing due to depictions of war crimes and battlefield violence. Viewer discretion is advised. If you found this story compelling, consider supporting the channel. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to follow more real history World War II documentaries on Canadian war history, battlefield heroics, and historical heroism. Your engagement helps preserve the memory of those who fought and fell, ensuring that the lessons of courage, discipline, and humanity remain alive. For more in-depth stories from World War II, check the links in the description and explore verified historical sources to learn about the Canadian Army, Victoria Cross recipients, Allied forces, and German resistance during World War II. The Normandy massacres are a testament to both the horrors of war and the enduring strength of ethical courage, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, light can prevail.